Welcome. Happy New Year. It is on. Chatting. Hi, everybody. I'll refrain from clapping like my teacher colleagues. Happy New Year to everybody. Nice to see you. We are missing Sheila and Katie, so we will proceed now with the agenda. Just sort of big picture. We've got our minutes as usual. We've got some committee updates. And from there, we're going to return to the Early Education and Out-of-School Time Capital Fund, which we had before us before public comment. And so it's circling back to us post-public comment. And then in general, the plan was to really spend some time on CCDBG, both in terms of what is before the agency by way of changes and compliance, and use the BRC as a chance to both provide an update, but also especially to provide a window into the business process redesign, which was part of our budget and is part of the work that will proceed in 2019. It's also a process that's going to guide the CCDBG work in other domains. So getting a sense of that today, I think, as a board will be helpful to get a window into the agency's work processes over the next several months, given the scope of the CCDBG changes and what's needed to react accordingly. So that's the plan. I will turn it over to the secretary.
I'll pass, Madam Chair.
And then I will turn it over to the commissioner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will not pass. Typically, I speak a little bit to the agenda, but because I'm going to be participating in one of the two presentations today, I'll just limit my comments on the agenda to a thank you, in particular to Denise Carlin, who's going to make the presentation around the EEOST grant, for having spearheaded the effort around updating the regulations that she will present to you today on behalf of the agency for your consideration, and we are proposing a vote to move those regulations today. So thank you very much, Denise, for your efforts. The second item I wish to update you on is, as I had previously reported, under the FY19 budget was created a new item, the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. This is an opportunity for the Commonwealth to support programs that are similar, although not exactly the same, as our preschool expansion grant model that we were able to fund under the federal preschool expansion grant. Final applications were due by last Friday. We had a dozen submissions as part of that process. Almost all of the, not all of the, but almost all of the planning grant communities, those that had received planning grants from the department previously in prior years, there had been planning grant money for communities to prepare for an opportunity like this, submitted applications. So we are reviewing those applications now. We'll make a determination which among those applications is eligible for full consideration, and then we'll be advancing that process. So I wanted to provide you with an update on where we stand relative to CPPI. We're obviously very excited to see the level of enthusiasm that came with this opportunity and with those dozen applications. A second update I want to provide starts with a congratulations to the Commonwealth and to the Executive Office of Education, and to our team here, and particularly I want to cite Jocelyn Bone for the work on the preschool development grant application. The Commonwealth received notice at the very end of calendar year 2018 that we were going to be a recipient of a preschool development grant. Yeah, it's exciting news. The Commonwealth is going to be receiving $1.8 million for this planning grant opportunity, and would be eligible, therefore, next year to apply for an implementation grant based on a subsequent application process. As it turned out, there were, I believe, 45 recipients across the states and territories. Each of the recipients received 71% precisely of what they had requested. So that amounted to the $1.8 million that I referenced previously. There are 5 activities that are planned under this planning grant. The first is to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment across state agencies and programs of the availability and program access for the Commonwealth's most vulnerable children. The second is to produce an action-oriented strategic plan in response to the results of that needs assessment. The third is to improve parent choice and knowledge through an online parent portal and through more effective implementation of screening services, including the Ages and Stages questionnaire. The fourth is to expand and coordinate training for all staff working with children in the Commonwealth. And the fifth and final is to develop an integrated data system that will help us analyze and track child services and outcomes longitudinally for home visiting. And this would extend from early intervention through our work here at EEC and through K-12 and post-secondary education. So those are the very laudable goals, so not very five, but five very laudable goals. And I know that the Executive Office of Education is engaged now in bringing on board a full-time project manager to oversee this work, and we'll be setting up a structure that will engage all the state agencies who participated in the application. It cut across both education and health and human services, inclusive of EEC, ESC, the Department of Public Health, and the Children's Trust Fund. So that's great news. Congratulations, Mr. Secretary, and we're looking forward to supporting EOE in that work over the course of this year.
Although I guess if they funded 71% across the board, we obviously should have asked for more money. Let's learn.
The fourth and final item that I wanted to bring to the board's attention is one that I'm really happy to do. It's more of a personal item for the agency. We have with us today Eric Lieberman, and I was hoping that, Eric, you would stand up. I promise to keep it relatively brief, so don't keep you on your feet too long. Thank you for waving. Eric is about to retire and has had an incredibly long and distinguished record here at EEC. Remarkably, April of 1981 was Eric's official start date. However, he informed me today that he actually interned for EEC prior to that. So his history goes back even beyond 1981. But he has served the agency over the course of that time for over 35 years. He started as a community representative in the area of the then Office of Families and Children.
Office for Children.
What's that?
Office for Children.
Office of Children, OCC. OFC, Office of for Children. See? All right, well, I have a confession to make. I don't know if it's a confession, it's just a fact of state. In 1981, I was 6 years old, so. So I don't know what I would have probably just learning the letters OFC, let alone what the acronym would have stood for. The Office for Children. And then he moved on to become a family child care licensor, residential and placements licensor, and a policy and training advisor to the subsidy unit, and most recently he's been working as part of our workforce unit here at EEC. Eric has been absolutely pivotal to our work in developing early STEM education efforts here at the agency. He's been our point person, bringing a lot of passion to that effort, and quite candidly, making it possible for our agency to make a mark within that work. It's a real credit to you, Eric. I don't think we would have made the progress that we made but for the leadership that you were willing to bring to that important effort. He's also managed the Early Educator Scholarship Fund, and he's developed the information and content for the new federally required health and safety, pre-licensing, and orientation for all EEC educators. His knowledge and experience has been incredibly valuable to the agency across his tenure, and he's extraordinarily well-loved by his by staff across the agency. He's a well-known figure across the state, but he's especially beloved by those who've gotten to know him best out in the western part of the state. He's worked for maybe every commissioner across the agency since the beginning of time, but I've had the pleasure of working with him now for nearly 6 years, and I want to thank him for the contributions that he's made to my work personally over the course of that time. He's certainly been among the many, many staff people here at EEC who have helped make me a better commissioner each and every day. And I thought it was important to take a moment here to recognize you as you start a new chapter of your life and maybe a new chapter of your career, but we certainly want to express our profound gratitude for all that you've done for us, Eric. So thank you. say a few words? For Eric's dartboard? Thank you.
So what I would say is there was a time when I was almost the youngest person in the room. Actually, when I started in 81, I think there were 2 or 3 people younger than I was, and one of them is in our office that I work with in Springfield. So for a lot of my work, it's been a collaborative process. You can't really do this work alone. So I definitely would thank my workforce colleagues, my regional office, my regional director. She and I have been working together for 25 years. So a collaboration like that really gets results. And again, I thank you for being a friend and a colleague and someone who's taken the work I've done and tried to move it forward. And also, Anita, I appreciate the work that we've done together on the foundational trainings, the health and safety, and the orientation work. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that comes out on our LMS once we get that. Well, thank you.
I can't end my remarks on a higher note than that, so I will conclude unless there are any questions.
Great, wonderful. So we will move now. We do not, as I understand it, have any statements from the public. So you can stand if you thought you were going to give a statement and we don't know about it, but otherwise we will move forward. All right, thank you. Minutes from December 11th, which this latest version looks good to me. Thanks to some of you for calling in some edits. Anything else to add to the corrections? Great. All in favor of the minutes from December 11th?
Aye.
Abstained or opposed? Thank you. Board committee updates. We had a workforce committee meeting just before the holiday break, and I was on the phone and under the weather, but I'm happy to give a short update, and Anita can feel free to add some color commentary if needed, and then we'll hear from Dave on fiscal, which just met this morning. The workforce meeting right before the holiday break was really first a chance to sort of take stock of where we'd been, particularly with respect to QRS, and talk a little about the planning for the latter half of this fiscal year. From there, we had a discussion especially about curriculum as part of the QRS and how we're going to think through the curriculum piece. We had a memo from ABD with some sort of status of where the research is and how EEC may both support the use of strong curriculum and in so doing, especially sort of signal to the field, here are the aspects, here are the elements that make a strong curriculum. And so we don't necessarily, Joan mentioned, raise the good issue of sort of, we don't really want to get into a kind of make work scenario where it's really about trying to manage on the compliance side, sort of checking for curriculum use, but instead to see it as an opportunity to cohere the field a little more around some elements that make good curricula. And so that sort of summarizes where we landed, I think, in that meeting and how we might go forward in that respect. And I think it really is a matter of thinking through those elements and the criteria per se. We also had an update on the CPPI that Tom mentioned with these dozen applications, and Ola gave us an update on the work on career pathways, which is at the time was posted for the community colleges. So I think that covers, with my slightly foggy memory of that day, our meeting. Any comments or questions in the workforce realm? Committee? Anita, good?
I'd say we talked briefly about interim standards for the QRIS.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, you're right.
We'll be bringing that back next meeting as well to finalize.
Yeah, and we didn't think that that those would rise to the level of a board presentation as much as just a sign off by the workforce committee. They're fairly straightforward. They also, for the most part, are guided by the spirit of reducing burden where there was no effect of the standard or the compliance process that goes with it. Great. Dave, do you want to talk about fiscal?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairperson. The Fiscal and Oversight Committee met this morning. We really talked about two things. One, talk a little bit about the impact of the current federal government shutdown situation. And you know, we're in uncharted waters here in terms of where this is all going. On a long-term basis, again, the impact would be more on the Commonwealth's cash flow than it would be on an impact to the EEC programs. But also, we have to take a look at the families we're serving. Potentially, there may be families that, you know, are federal employees that are beginning to feel, certainly this week anyway, the impact of that action. So we're going to have to be, you know, certainly aware of that. The department believes that it has in place some policies that will be able to support the situation that some families may find themselves in, and we're, although we don't certainly want them to get to that point, I think the department feels comfortable that, you know, we can kind of deal with some of those issues. But we may have a clearer picture this evening, I think, after the President's address in terms of where some of this may be going. But we're in day 18. Don't think a lot of us expected we'd be in day 18, but we are where we are. But we certainly going to continue to monitor and watch it very, very carefully. The second presentation we had was on the caseload from Carol Meehan. And just wanted to talk a little bit about the wait list, as I know it came up at our December meeting. Currently on the wait list, as of yesterday, we have just short of 18,000 students, 17,939, and that's a decrease of about 1,600 from where we were when we started, at least the school year in August. So we're certainly making some progress in that wait list. We looked at each of the 4 age groups, infant, toddler, preschool, and school age, to try to look at if there's trends and things we should be watching and doing there. So we're making some progress in reducing the wait list. But we're going to continue to, you know, monitor that on a monthly basis.
Thanks. Questions? Gentlemen.
Just a comment, David. I'm really thrilled that not happy that you had to, but thrilled that you did talk about families and the impact on families, because we certainly know that there's going to be a ripple effect for whatever happens financially, and we, the board, the department, function on the premise that the family is the child's first teacher,
Sure.
and we want to keep them as supportive as possible. So thank you to you and your committee for addressing that.
Yeah, I think in these situations, there's this is more than just money. When you have a situation where you have this kind of stress in a family unit, that kind of emotionality tends, you know, to make its way into the into the classroom. So it's something that's going to have to be looked at pretty carefully.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. So we will move into our items for discussion and action, starting with a presentation on the Early Education and Out-of-School Time Capital Fund, the regulation amendments. I should say that the upshot is there were 2 comments, and they're not viable ones for amendment. So we're effectively looking at the same regs that we looked at in December, or was it November? November, excuse me. So with that, turn it over to you, Denise and Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Lasso, members of the board, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber. Thank you for giving me this time. As Chairman Lasso said, the regs were voted on to be put out for public comment in November, and we had a public comment period. Before we get to that, why don't we jump to slide 9, if we could? This is just an update. The former presentation had listed all of the various grant rounds in the EEOST program. Over the years, we are now in the fiscal 19 round. We received 12 pre-applications, and out of the 12 who submitted pre-applications, out of the 12 programs, 8 were invited to submit full applications.
And Janice, I haven't found it yet. There we go.
Okay, sure. And so the full applications applications are due on January 29th, and at that point will be reviewed intensively by Children's Investment Fund and CDAC, and the recommendations for grant awards will be made to EEC in the spring when Bill and I and Sean Reynolds and other members of the review team will meet with them, and then EEC will then recommend which of the applicants should receive grants and forward those recommendations to the governor's office in approximately May of 2019, and then the grant awards should be announced sometime in June of 2019. It's a very robust and thorough process, and Teresa Jordan from Children's Investment Fund is here today. There are site visits conducted to each applicant, and one might wonder, why does a process that starts actually in October take until April and May? But it is very intense, and we want to thank Children's Investment Fund and CDAC for the partnering that they do with us on these awards. Now, if we jump over to slide 13, we'll get into the public comment. Actually, excuse me, Bill, slide 12. So on November 13, 2018, the board authorized EEC to solicit public comment on the amendments to the EEOST Capital Fund regulations. The public comment ran from November 14th until December 21st, and EEC received 2 written public comments. Unlike other regulations which have gone out recently for public comment, there was not exactly a groundswell of public comments. And what the public comments said, actually, as Chairman Lasso alluded, are not directly related to the grant. They were both from family child care providers. One requested that the grant program be opened to family child care providers. Unfortunately, the statute that has been passed by the legislature does not allow that. These grants are specifically for large group and school age and programs, and no other types of programs. And then the second comment, which was also from a family child care provider who was actually considering opening up a group program, was that we should allow programs, we should allow programs that are not currently licensed to apply for EEOST grants. That used to be the case, and we found that not a lot of programs could apply for it, that they really weren't prepared, and we've only made a very small number of awards, I believe 3, perhaps 4, out of the 25 that we've made in the past 5 years. The legislature chose to amend the statute to say only programs that are currently licensed, which means holds an umbrella license. They could open up a new program at a new site, but it has to be under a currently licensed umbrella program, could be open. So unfortunately, we cannot take action on those 2 public comments. So next slide. So given those comments, we are recommending that no changes be made to the draft regulations. And then the next slide is the updated timetable. We can get these over to the Secretary of State's office for promulgation anytime now. And once we get them over, they're published. We need 2 weeks. They need 2 weeks' notice, the Secretary of State's office, to publish them in the Mass Register, and then they become officially promulgated the date they are published in the Mass Register. The earliest that can happen is January 25th. If it's published, if we miss somehow the deadline for getting it in for January 25th, because we would have to have it in by the end of this week, we can always do it in February. It's we actually are not under a huge time constraint to get them published, but we will get them published as expeditiously as possible. And that being said, you have a motion in front of you to promulgate them, but if there are any questions or any discussion, I'm available to take those.
Questions or comments? All right. Oh, go ahead, Mary.
These are, I don't know, maybe Teresa, if you're allowed, maybe you can answer this, but having been involved in a project on this, with this grant, is it it's very rigorous. Have we had any organizations be approved and awarded funding, but somehow not take it to the point of actually doing the project?
No. Everyone has done the project. There have been some that have needed extensions, but we've worked with them. Teresa and Bree Horowitz and the other folks at Children's Investment Fund work very closely with these programs to get them to full financial closing for the grant, and anytime that an extension is requested, they have good backup reasons for why, and everybody has come to closing, so we have never had somebody who has not been able to come to closing.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead and make the motion?
Sure.
Great. I move that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with Massachusetts General Law C-15D3, hereby approve 606 CMR 15, the proposed amended regulations governing the Early Education and Out-of-School Time Capital Fund Program, and that the board also authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to file the proposed amended regulations with the Secretary of the Commonwealth for publication in the Massachusetts Register as 606 CMR 15 in accordance with Massachusetts General Law C-30A. Have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Abstained? Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
Denise.
Thank you.
everybody.
Can I just ask a question?
Oh,
Denise,
sure.
Please, interrupt.
Of course.
Kind of thinking about Mary's question and one that I had before. I don't know if it's possible, and not to make additional work, seriously not to do that, but I'm wondering if we have any data that talks about the programs that have received funding, and not only how are they doing, but is there any impact on quality? You know, have we got to measure that yet?
That is actually something that the Children's Investment Fund is directly involved with, and I'm not sure if Teresa would like to speak to it briefly now, or whether you'd like some sort of a written update. Which would you prefer?
What we might want to do is bring this to workforce and have a discussion about it in light of quality indicators, that some of which certainly align with some of our discussions around QRIS.
Thanks, Denise.
And any time.
Commissioner, excuse me.
Tom works too. Thank you.
Does work too.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to note that probably as we're moving through the process of evaluating this year's applicants, we will be coming forward with a presentation to the Fiscal and Oversight Committee. So it's possible that we might be able to merge those conversations within that presentation. That might be a good
Yes.
step.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, one more thought on that.
Sure.
I agree with the questions around impact and quality. The other thing that we might look at, and I think CDAC has done this, or the Children's Investment Fund, is how much the funds that we're putting out are leveraging significant other funding.
Absolutely.
And having an economic development impact in terms of whether it's construction projects or employment. I think there's a really a bigger story here, even more than just what we have. And so I know some of that information exists, but maybe at some point we ought to toot our horn a little more, not meaning the department, I mean the state as a whole, and what all the various implications of this particular program are.
What I'd like to just briefly add to that is, Mary, is that the EEOST grant, what we always tell programs when we do our information sessions is view this as your last piece of funding, not your first piece of funding. So you're absolutely right. Without the EEOST grants, many of these programs could not go forward. We are the essential piece that is needed, and it absolutely does bring other jobs, and in addition to supporting the families with quality initiatives and with incredible facilities, it does provide jobs in construction and early education, architecture, I mean, many things. I have to do a small business impact statement for the Secretary of State's office, and we often do address that. So absolutely, the EEOST grant is very vital. Without this grant, many of these programs could not have fit in that last piece of funding.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. So we'll turn now to our second agenda item, which is the CCDBG, both the project update overall and then a focus in on background record checks, sort of twofold. One, the background record checks have been an enormous amount of work at the agency level, and it's worth hearing about that. But second, they, in order to do that work, have implemented some of this process that will be applied to subsequent aspects of the CCDBG work to sort of have the agency working in slightly different ways given this project. So I'll turn it over to the commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the board. I'm Commissioner Tom Weber. Happy to be joined here today with our EEC General Counsel, Felicia Sullivan, with Assistant General Counsel, Tom Myers, and with President and CEO of Acceler, Jack Calhoun. We're going to jointly make this presentation to you today about CCDBG, where the agency currently stands, and in particular, we're going to focus on the background record check process and where we are vis-a-vis a rollout. And the process that we've undertaken to support our background record check work, because it's not only illustrative of the tremendous amount of activity that's gone into supporting the background record check changes that we're required to implement on behalf of the Commonwealth, but also instructive of the kinds of processes that we're going to be using to support our other CCDBG compliance areas, as well as the business process redesign that the agency has undertaken. And so to that end, I've really covered, I think, the second slide, which is to let you know what the purpose of this presentation is. It's to cut across those three areas, to give you an update on the rollout of BRC, to give you a sense of the process that supported that work and is going to continue to support our efforts, and to provide you with information with respect to our CCDBG responsibilities that remain. So to make that happen, the agenda is going to provide a brief history of the Child Care Development Block Grant in our state plan. So we'll provide you with a timeline as well as the key areas of focus that we have remaining. We're going to provide you with a summary of the Child Care Development Block Grant background record check requirements, including the definition of success that we've established for the project, the major components of the project, the statutory and regulatory changes that we're striving to meet, as well as the kind of project team that we've utilized to get the work done, and an introduction to the processes that we've used to support that work. And then finally, we want to provide you, the board, as well as the public through this presentation, and we're doing a considerable amount of communication and outreach outside of this board meeting, with a plan for our rollout for the background record check project, as well as a sense of what the project management structure and work streams have been to make all of this happen, and to provide you with a systems overview through some screenshots so you can get a sense of exactly what it is that we're working towards to be able to support all aspects of our background record check laws. And then we'll conclude with some next steps. So, as background, as you know, the Child Care Development Block Grant was reauthorized in 2014. It's focusing on two primary objectives: to promote economic self-sufficiency for low-income families, and importantly, and this is a marked departure from its predecessor, to support the healthy development and school readiness needs of children. So in order to receive these funds, the Commonwealth is required to submit a plan, the CCDF state plan, every 3 years rather than every 2 years to denote that we're meeting our requirements under the law. We submitted in November our CCDF state plan and received feedback from ACF at the very end of calendar year 2018, so on December 21st precisely. And we're going to provide some information relative to the response that we got back from ACF to you today as part of this presentation. So this is the briefest of histories of CCDBG reauthorization, because we could pull it all the way back to 2014. But importantly, and actually what immediately predates August of 2018, at the beginning of the summer, all states and territories received final guidance from the federal government with respect to the Child Development Block Grant. While the law was actually reauthorized in 2014, it was a very iterative process, to say the least, in terms of getting guidance from the federal government. So all states received that federal guidance right before the summer, and then we had a deadline for submitting the first draft of our CCDF state plan at the end of the summer, and we did submit that plan in draft form on August 31st. September 30th of 2018 was the deadline to meet many of the remaining CCDBG requirements. On November 2nd, we submitted a final plan, rather, to the federal government based on the feedback that we had received on our draft plan. And then, as I just noted earlier, on December 21st, we received provisional approval of our state plan, along with notification of the areas that required corrective action, what will be referenced in the remainder of this presentation as our cap. All 50 states and territories, by the way, I think it's worth noting, received provisional approval and received caps as part of this process. It's, as I noted, been a very iterative process with the federal government, very collaborative, and we're obviously understanding of our need to maintain compliance, but I think the federal government also is understanding of the challenging nature of these laws and the timing of the guidance, and therefore has provided all states and territories with additional time to meet any outstanding requirements, including those which we're going to present to you today, are those that remain for the Commonwealth. So we have a deadline at the end of next month, the end of February, to submit our corrective action plan steps to OCC. We have a monitoring visit that is going to be coming up in April, so the 23rd through the 25th will be the 3 days that are scheduled for us to have a OCC monitoring visit, and we're already engaged in planning with OCC for that visit. And then the deadline to meet any remaining CCDBG requirements is September 30th of 2019. I'm now going to turn this portion of the presentation over to Tom Myers. Tom, as you know, is the co-administrator for CCDF for the Commonwealth. Tom's going to walk through the response that we got back from ACF relative to the remaining corrective action steps in the 8 areas that we're going to be working on over the course of this year, which also includes the background record check presentation that we're going to be providing today.
Thank you, Tom. So as Commissioner Weber noted, so I'm going to walk you through the next 2 slides that essentially addresses the 8 categories that we received corrective action on. And as Commissioner Weber noted, this essentially extends our corrective action to come into compliance until September 30th of 2019. So I'm going to go through here and just give a brief overview of some of the corrective action areas, which is broken down into 8 categories. So before I start, I'll just note that several of these categories actually just focus around license exempt or funded programs. So the department actually has processes in place for the license programs. It just needs to apply those to the funded license exempt programs. So I'll note those when they arise. The first category is the disaster preparedness and response plan. So under the requirements, we have to ensure that all programs have some sort of written plan in place to address any emergencies or disaster situations. Under our current licensing regulations, this is already in place for licensed programs. We do have that in our regulations, and it's required for them to have a disaster and written plan for emergency evacuations. So really our objective here is to develop some policies and procedures as well as a communication plan around applying this to licensed exempt providers. So essentially using those policies towards those programs. The next category here is consumer and provider education. So there's a couple pieces under here that we're on corrective action for. The first is a complaint process. So under the regulations, we have to have some sort of complaint process. So for responding to, investigating and substantiating complaints. Again, this is something that we have for our license programs. We have policies in place for them to submit complaints, to respond to complaints, and all of that. This is just something that we need to have a policy to address those license exempt and funded programs. Under the consumer education piece as well is a major piece of the monitoring and inspection reports. So we need to have a process in place to post these monitoring inspection reports online so that they're accessible to the consumer, the parents. We also have to be able to post aggregate data on substantial injuries and child deaths. So these are requirements under the CCDBG. So there are some steps we need to take in this regard, and that is developing policies around what that'll look like, some procedures, and communication and IT plans for applying both the complaint process and as well as the inspection report. So there's some IT enhancements as well as a lot of communication and some policies that will need to be developed. So we will spell out that in our corrective action plan and kind of roll out our timeline for the website enhancements to get that in place. The next piece got...
Just before you go any further,
Sure.
can I just ask a clarifying question? So these areas that require corrective action are specific to our plan that we submitted, correct?
Correct.
And again, this is not, any kind of negative comment. Is the areas that we have these corrective actions required because we didn't know about these, or we just didn't go far enough in terms of what we've submitted? I'm just curious.
I'd say it's a combination of things. One, obviously, there's a number of changes that are required under the federal law, so there's been a required prioritization as to how we go about implementing new mandates. The requirement, the deadline was not to have a plan in place by September 30th, but to be able to meet all of the standards of what would be required under CCDF by September 30th. So it wasn't that our plan was necessarily deficient, it's that the plan was only part, a plan to get to the other end of the work. So, so effectively what they have laid out, these are the areas that remain for us to implement in order to be in full compliance. And now under the extension, full compliance by September 30th of 2019. But the important part is, as I noted earlier, the full guidance was provided to us at the beginning of the summer. We obviously drafted our CCF state plan on the basis of having received that guidance, submitted it, had an opportunity to go back and forth with OCC with respect to our plan. Now we have a pretty concrete sense of exactly what will be needed in order to come into full compliance. And we have, frankly, a desire to go, in some cases, beyond just compliance, but having that level of specificity obviously is going to be important to land these items.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question. I think that you mentioned, Commissioner, that in responding and in creating this, that there's, the way I understood it, overlap or creating foundation that will relate to other aspects that will come out over time, I think. Is there a way for you to highlight or at least help us know where you're thinking some of those things as you're telling us about this?
Sure. So many of the areas of CCDF point to health and safety and are obviously, I think, rooted within what has been viewed as our licensing work. The effort that we're undertaking and what we are looking to spell out to you today speaks to a process that's intended to be broader than just our child care development block grant responsibilities. It's part of what we see as a really important, I think, and ultimately necessary opportunity for this agency to reorganize itself to more fully realize the mission of this agency, which is intended to support high-quality early learning and to ensure that children and families are achieving the kinds of outcomes that we want. So we're not looking at this simply as an opportunity to just sort of advance our licensing work, but seeing it as part of an opportunity because, as Tom pointed out earlier, there's going to be a necessary effort to update our regulations, our policies, some of the standards that the agency is responsible for creating in a way that should be cross-cutting and beyond just sort of simple functions, but really think about how we're actually undertaking our work, more fully. So, a prime example of that is thinking about background record checks, which we're going to focus our time on today. Historically, it's been a compliance activity of this agency. We've organized it as part of our sort of legal or maybe our health and safety work, but really it's something that we think should be viewed as part of our overall workforce effort because it's a prerequisite for those that are working in this field, and you can see the value of connecting For example, our background record check work, with our teacher qualifications work, with our professional development work, with the coaching infrastructure that we've engaged the board in discussion around, and we might advance through the ECSO, Early Childhood Support Organization efforts. That's a area of work that at the moment functionally is not aligned within the agency, but we see as having real opportunity for alignment. So it does relate to our child care development block grant responsibilities, but if we looked at it that narrowly, we wouldn't really be achieving sort of the larger, I think, exercise of better aligning our resources in our agency capacity in support of programs and trying to achieve the kinds of child outcomes and family outcomes that we know might be possible if we were to do that. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Yeah, I think when IT came up, and that was just
And that is very important. And IT changes are not easy. And I would point maybe as an example of that is consumer education. We obviously have, over the course of the agency's history, compiled a considerable amount of compliance-related data, largely through pen and paper. It was only in the course of the last 5 years that we've moved to systems that electronically are able to capture that, the use of tablets within the field so that our licensors are not out with pen and paper, but rather have the ability to instantly register within a new system that we developed, the LEAD system, to support our licensing work. But we also need to make sure that we're configuring those systems so that it's capturing the information not simply for compliance purposes, but capturing it in a way that can translate it so that it is useful to consumers. And that's among the activities that I'd point to. But there's an IT component to a lot of this, but we also want to make sure that we're developing our IT systems, again, not to just take care of discrete functions, but in a way that would connect across all of our work so that we're creating an interconnectedness between our IT systems that support our subsidy work, that support our policy and programmatic efforts, that support what has historically been our licensing work, so that it really all becomes, quite candidly, program support and educator support, just simply falling under those two buckets.
Great, thank you. I'll move on to category 3 here, which is parental choice. So the requirement here is simply that all programs have some sort of policy in place that allows parents to access their children at all times. So again, this is something that we have in our regulations and policies for licensing and applies to licensed programs. We just need to develop the policies, procedures, as well as the communication plan to applying this to license-exempt providers. Category 4 relates to equal access. And this is to certify that our payment rates are sufficient to ensure equal access and are comparable with non-CCDF programs. So under CCDBG, the benchmark for rates is the 75th percentile, and although it's not a requirement, it's a benchmark. They actually are, putting a corrective action plan for states that aren't at the 75th percentile, just to highlight the fact that they want states to, strive for that benchmark requirement. So many states across the nation actually received a corrective action plan in this area. So for our plan for the corrective action plan is to essentially outline our rate history increases and outline our next steps to achieving rate increases. So category 5 here is health and safety requirements, and this relates to health and safety standards. So these are the measuring tools for when we go out to a program and make sure they're in compliance with these health and safety standards. So again, we're in compliance with licensed programs, so our license regulations meet all of these 11 health and safety standards, and it's just a matter of developing these same policies and procedures to apply to the funded license-exempt programs. This is the same process of the policies and procedures, communication plan towards the license-exempt programs. The category number 6 is health and safety requirements, and these relate to the training. So these are having the trainings for the 11 categories of health and safety, and these are applying to both license and license-exempt programs. So while we currently have some health and safety trainings for licensed programs, we don't have all 11 in place right now for licensed programs. So this applies to both license and license-exempt programs. So what we'll be doing here is really just outlining our timeline for the development of the learning management system so that we can put those trainings in effect and have providers being able to take these trainings. Category 7 is the enforcement of licensing and health and safety requirements. So this is essentially the monitoring piece and ensuring that all programs are getting at least one yearly unannounced visit. So again, the corrective action plan here is relating to the license exempt programs. This is something that we've already implemented in our license programs. Again, we have to develop the same processes to apply these to the exempt programs. And then the final category is the background record checks, which we'll get into more detail here. And these a major piece of this is certifying that we're in compliance with the background record check requirements for license exempt programs. So this will require us to hit these 4 milestones, which have been addressed in previous presentations. So an in-state criminal check, a child welfare check, an FBI fingerprint, and a sex offender check. If we can hit these 4 milestones and apply these to well, right now we're applying to license programs, but if we apply these to license exempt programs as well, the department will actually be eligible for a waiver, which will extend out even past September 30th of 2019, and that will allow us to come into compliance with the out-of-state checks and running the backlog of existing employees. So that will actually extend out through September 30th of 2020, and we hope to obtain that waiver once we come into compliance with the exempt piece.
So we're about to pivot within the presentation to the background record check project, but before we do that, I just wanted to note, we obviously laid out within the course of those prior 2 slides, those areas that we're going to continue to be working on with respect to CCDF over the course of this upcoming year. They're going to be intensive efforts. They're high priority efforts. We expect to come back to the board next month, and it's going to be part of our regular report out to the board over the course of the first 9 months of this year as we're heading to September 30th of 2019. The presentation that remains is designed to focus on the background record check project, importantly because we're about to roll out a new system and we need everyone to understand exactly what that system entails. But as I noted earlier, also to speak to the kinds of processes that we've used to be able to develop that system and to support that system, because they're illustrative of the kinds of approaches that we're going to be taking, not just for the remainder of our CCDBG work, but also as we look at the business process redesign opportunity for this agency. So I just wanted to pause here before we move into the background record check piece, and we're going to obviously provide some context for what it is that we're looking to accomplish within background record checks, to see if you have any further questions before we move into that section of the presentation. And I will now hand it over to Felicia Sullivan.
Good afternoon. So I wanted to give you an overview of background record checks again. So just as a reminder of where we stand now versus where we used to be. EEC traditionally only did a query check or the in-state criminal check. We transitioned to a DCF check in 2006, and then in 2013 we ended up rolling out the sex offender check and the fingerprint-based check requirement, and that was all state required by state statute. Then we had the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which brought in a number of additional requirements on a federal level. So we had these existing requirements that were reflected in our system as of 2014, and then we had to then begin a transition over to a number of additional changes, which precipitated changes to our statute, to our regulations, and then to our IT system. So with respect to our old process, anyone right now, it used to be that anyone who has a potential for unsupervised contact with children was subject to an EEC background record check. The change that is being implemented as required federally is that all staff be run through a background record check, regardless of whether they have unsupervised access to children. So this would mean individuals such as the janitor, the cook, people who aren't actually around the children now have to be run on and this is a federal requirement. Additionally, on a state level, we had been requiring the CORI check, DCF check for supported findings of abuse or neglect, a sex offender check, and a fingerprint-based check. So that's what was in place prior to CCDBG. Under CCDBG, we are now mandated, and we will be implementing this in the future, is the National Sex Offender Registry check, and then a criminal, child welfare, and sex offender checks in every state where an individual has resided within the prior 5 years. So we're still working on transitioning to those checks, and this is something that has been pushed out for not just Massachusetts, but other states as well. Another change is the disqualifications categories. So as it used to exist before CCDBG, we only had 2 categories of disqualifications. There were categories called discretionary disqualifications, which were the less serious criminal offenses, and then the more serious criminal offenses were the presumptive disqualifications. And the presumptive disqualifications mandated that we do an additional, we receive an additional amount of information. It was a heightened review. So we still have those 2 categories, but under federal law, there was a new category created called mandatory disqualifications, and that was implemented at EEC in October of 2018. And these offenses are those that have been specifically outlined in federal law as being a disqualification no matter what. So it's a conviction for anything on a mandatory list. There's offenses such as murder, rape, robbery. There's a whole host of offenses that are on that list. They're the most serious offenses that you'll see. The thing about the mandatory disqualifications is there may be people who are working in our programs right now who will be disqualified as a result of having a mandatory disqualification. So that's already started, and we're rolling that through as people now are going through their background record check process.
Alicia, are they all felonies?
They are almost all felonies. There's a list of violent misdemeanors that are included as well. Additionally, the federal law made a significant change that's really impacting EEC's business in the background record check. It used to be that EEC would permit group and school age programs to run the CORI and DCF check and review any adverse information from a CORI or DCF check. So EEC would run the check, but then the results are sent out to programs, and they assess whether the person is appropriate for working in the program given our regulations. Now, under federal law, we are not allowed to pass along that CORI or DCF information to programs, so EEC now has to bring all of that information in-house, which is going to significantly impact our volume of work. So we are transitioning to that. We haven't fully phased that in yet, but we will be phasing it in the new system. Additionally, another major change, under CCDBG, we had to implement something called provisional hiring, which means that in group and school age programs, individuals can only begin working if they're new, if they have completed a sex offender check and they have had a fingerprint check. So that was implemented as of December, and previously it used to be that people could begin to work in a group and school age program after they completed the CORI, a DCF, and a SORI check, and those were all approved. So this is just a shift from the unsupervised conditional to the supervised provisional. The other component of the other difference between those statuses is that under the federal law, if you have that fingerprint scan and approved SORI, you actually have to be supervised by somebody in the program at all times, and it just has to be somebody who's had a background record check and has been found suitable by EEC previously. And so this is a shift from the old rule under unsupervised conditional hiring, which allowed somebody to work unsupervised after the 3 CORI, DCF, and SORI were completed.
Hi, yeah, just a question. And so I recognize that the fact that EEC can no longer disseminate this information to providers and now has to do all that work within EEC is a major demand on resources. But I guess what I also want to understand is how often are these background checks repeated? Because obviously just because someone clears a background check, once they start working there, something might happen, and how do you find out that information?
So we are under the state statute required to run everyone at least 3 years, every 3 years. And if anything comes up, we have a provision within our regulations to require that individuals be rerun. Another component that we are looking into in the future is something called subsequent activity, which would allow their criminal check to be rerun on a daily basis. So our regulations are built to allow for that, but it's just something that needs to be developed and implemented in the system.
Thank you.
Daily?
Yes. It's already actually, it's been implemented. Yes, it's been implemented for DPU already. So we are looking into that in the future, but that'll probably be farther down the line once we've implemented the mandatory requirements. Dave's got a question.
Yeah, in the new third category of disqualifying offenses, the mandatory disqualifications for an incumbent employee, does CCDBG set forth any type of an appeal process for that employee?
No, there's not an appeals process allowed. So really, the only appeal is that if they contest that their record actually reflects that information, then they can appeal in that way. But if they agree that there is a felony conviction for that serious offense, then there's no further appeal rights.
There's no statute of time set forth in the regulation that if the felony was, let's say, 20 years prior to date of hire, that felony is...
No, under the federal law, it's a lifetime ban, no matter what.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. One, and I don't know if we can get to the answers yet, is do you anticipate what the impact on programs might be? And then just as importantly, what about the impact and capacity of the department as we begin to implement these in terms of numbers of staff and time-wise?
Right, so that is something that's an important consideration and something that we've been tracking so far and will continue to track in the new system. We have, right now, we have a spreadsheet since mandatory disqualifications were implemented, and we've been, we have a spreadsheet that follows that. It's been under, I think at this point, it's something like around 30, so out of all of the checks that have been run. So it's really not a high percentage so far.
And I'm sorry, I'm talking about all of these.
Oh, okay, yep. Yes, so that's something that we, within our new system, hope to be able to track. And we have a work stream called Staffing and Support that it's looking at numbers and data.
Yeah.
Very good.
I was just going to add to that. It's an excellent question. I appreciate your asking it. So I do think that the first part of Felicia's answer is relevant to your question as far as the sort of direct impacts, as far as how it might reduce the workforce. The impacts of the mandatories, will be relatively small. The overall effort here, though, is to produce a system that actually would turn around background record checks much more quickly than the current system provides. And while we reference here the 45-day turnaround, we envision that the system, and are developing a system that in the case of a clean hit, so somebody that actually has no record, nothing is going to result in any considerable time for review, that those could be turned around in a matter of days, as opposed to a process that typically takes some weeks now. So that obviously should be of benefit to programs that are competing in a really tight environment right now for workforce. So it would prove to be an asset. There is obviously significant new responsibilities for our agency within the course of all this. So for sort of the second part of your question about the impacts on us, it's considerable. But as Felicia pointed out, one of the work streams that we've identified is tasked with looking at this, and we have begun to make provisions for resources, and we've in fact hired staff already and have provisions to hire some additional staff. But we're monitoring that, and if necessary, we'll undertake steps that would try to right-size our capacity to be able to meet our responsibilities under the law.
Thank you for both sides of that. I'm interested also in, as you had said, the impact on programs, because we have programs who are always needing new hires yesterday. and we have student teachers and interns and all who have to get into programs. And so the quicker we can do this is quicker.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think one of the really huge benefits of the new system is that it's streamlining everything into one place, and it creates higher level of visibility for the program. They're able to see, to have the roster in front of them, and we'll show you later what the screenshot is, but they're actually able to see where each person is at. And as the commissioner indicated, the turnaround time for those without records will be much shorter than it is now. So just on the last point, I know the commissioner already talked about it. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to ask, because I've actually gone through this background check process personally, and, you know, sometimes, and was a reviewer too in a program, and I guess that I'm a little concerned about, beyond the mandatory disqualification piece, that the information is no longer going to be provided to the programs. And so does that mean that EEC then becomes the ultimate decision maker based on the discretionary and presumptive qualifications? And I say that because depending on what the issue was, you could use your, you know, experience with the individual, getting to know them, hearing their side of the story, sort of reviewing all that factual information to see whether or not it was something that was truly of a concern, or, you know, sort of like a misdirected youth decision, right? So I guess I'm just wondering, so does that now all shift to EEC to say you decide
Yes.
who stays and who goes?
Yes.
And the providers have no ability to say, you know, well, this person, we've known them for 10 years or whatever, you know?
And that's a large concern that's been raised to us before, and unfortunately, our hands are tied under the federal law. We have to limit dissemination of this information. What our response has been, though, is that programs have the ability to run the query themselves. If they really want to take a look at the person closely before they hire them, then that's a way that they can do it. Additionally, there are factors that are clearly laid out in our regulations that our background record check staff they follow, and they complete a write-up, and there's a very thorough process. The candidate has the opportunity to provide them with documentation. They have conversations. So, you know, everything that a program was supposed to do in our regulations is actually being done here in-house by the BRC unit.
Right, except there's no relationship. You know,
Right.
There's no
And
history of the
what-
individual that,
Yep.
you know, the people that they know versus sort of what, you know, that's concerning to me that it's that rigid.
The one thing that we did add after the regulatory process, after that concern was raised, was we allowed for another item to be provided, which would be a reference from the program. If the program so elects, it's an optional piece, they can submit something on behalf of the candidate. And, you know, if a program feels strongly about somebody, that's the way that, you know, they should submit the information to the BRC unit. So I think that, you know, we're trying to strike the appropriate balance here under the circumstances, but we do recognize that it is a challenge for programs not knowing that information. And at the end of the day, the programs still are the ones who are making the hiring decisions. We're just determining whether they pass the background record check process that's required by state and federal law. Okay. All right, so I will move on to the next slide. So the background record check IT system is a comprehensive system that will streamline a lot of our older, more antiquated processes. The main system that we're using right now is actually, was last updated in the 1990s. So we are really excited to bring on the new background record check IT system. In order for us to get to where we are at now, we went through a very significant process involving the governor's office, EOE, the commissioner, and others within the agency, in Exceller as well, who helped us pull together this definition of success on the background record check IT process. So within our definition of success for 2019 for a background record check process, we determined that success for EEC is staff supporting providers and candidates in legally compliant, timely, and accurate BRCs based on clearly understood standard operating procedures through an automated, efficient, streamlined system or through temporary manual processes. So basically, our goal is to automate this as much as possible and to make our system as streamlined as possible, understanding that at the very beginning there may be some manual processes, but we really are looking at automation, which will help not only EEC but everybody, the candidates and the programs. Additionally, we, within our review of the background record check IT system, we determined what the success means for providers. And that means that the staff are able to run their programs more effectively by understanding the implications of the new requirements, using an automated, efficient, streamlined system to meet those requirements more quickly and easily, and being confident in EEC to manage reviews. So one of the big things that programs will do now is they're able to manage a roster of their staff. They're able to see exactly who has and has not been completed for a fingerprint, and they'll be able to have the status at their fingertips. So they are also able to run new background record checks through the new system. And again, our goal is to make this as automated and efficient as possible. Additionally, just to, with respect to providers, I just want to note that with the support of the Exceller team, EEC has been able to really revisit the customer service part of our agency. Throughout the implementation of fingerprinting, we really have begun to see a huge ramp up of questions, and people have been calling and emailing, so we've really done a really good job about looking at customer service, and I'm excited about how the customer service component will look as we roll out the new IT system in 2019. Additionally, success for BRC candidates is using a simple, easy-to-understand system to complete their BRCs. A note on that is the candidate who we're talking about is a person who has a hit on the record. Right now, we have a mail process and a manual spreadsheet that's used in order to mail out documents to the candidate, in order to receive information inbound. It's all back and forth by mail, email, or fax. That is not an efficient process. So within the BRC Navigator, the new BRC IT system, we will have a way for candidates to upload their information, and that would end up going directly into the system. Additionally, when EEC receives that information, they will be applying our factors, as I mentioned earlier. That information will be typed up directly into the BRC Navigator. Right now, we type up our reviews in a Word document and it's saved, on our computers. This will be a much more efficient process, and it'll be easier when someone calls up to find out the status for us to communicate exactly where they are in the process. And then at the very end of this slide, it says success for EEC staff, providers, and BRC candidates is getting the help they need when they need it. And I'll turn it over to Jack.
Good afternoon. I'm Jack Calhoun. I'm the president and CEO of Exceller, the firm that is helping out on this work. Would it be helpful to know a little bit about Exceller, or you folks? Exceller is a Massachusetts company that I co-founded. We've done such work as, if you've heard about the RMV and the dual line queuing that the governor references, and how they've got their customer service to under 30 minutes, that we supported the RMV and all of that work, and also helped them pick up the remnants of a failed systems project and implement a new core system, which they're halfway through now. My personal work goes back about 30 years in this area, and I actually helped the governor with the turnaround of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare 20 years ago. I was one of the principal architects of the turnaround and worked with him on that for about 5 years. And though Exceller does not do much public sector work, we're starting to work more in this field. I helped write a best-selling book on this subject called Re-Engineering the Corporation, and it's about how you rethink your models to provide better services at lower costs. And going back about 4 generations, my grandfather was Vice President of the United States twice. My formal name is John Caldwell Calhoun Jr., so I do have public sector in my blood, and I hope to do more. It's been really a pleasure to work with this agency and other agencies. In this work, as this slide depicts, there's about 23 different processes that this system will support. And if you scratch the surface of any technology endeavor, right underneath the surface is a business process. Information technology is tools to enable better business processes. And really the first order question is, what is the business process? There's about 23 of these processes that 23 versions of the process that background checks do. About 86% of the candidates are auto-approved. 14% require manual handling, some form of review, whether it's an initial review, an escalated review, et cetera. And approximately 1% will have a mandatory, or actually less probably than 1% will have some type of mandatory automated also disqualifying event. So the work really focuses on what are the business processes. We're documenting all the processes from a customer perspective. So how does the candidate experience the process, end-to-end processes? How does the program or provider and the program administrator experience the end-to-end process? And that customer journey, if you will, of the various constituents that use the service is a really important and often overlooked part of a technology project or a process re-engineering effort. And you really need to start all the way out at the customer and find how they navigate through the process, how they find out about how the process works, how they apply, how they work through the process. The technology is really enablers. In this case, we're using very modern technology. It's being done on Amazon Web Services, which is the most contemporary, and in particular, the government cloud on AWS, it's called. And it's a very secure and certified environment because you're handling a lot of PII in this business process. And finally, we'll be looking at the organization and staffing model, not only the number of staff, but how they're organized to better accomplish these processes. And we're also doing a lot of work on our project expertise, because when you really think about it, agencies do processes to serve their constituents, and they do projects to improve those processes to better serve the constituents. So we're trying to be better at both the processes and the projects. As I mentioned, the system is built on the Amazon Web Services cloud, and it also utilizes a number of services from both the state level and the federal level for doing these checks. So the checks are automated messages that get processed in the background. We're leveraging all of that infrastructure for those checks, so we're not reinventing any of that. And the application itself will have 3 access points. The program portal, which the licensees and program administrators will be able to self-serve through the portal. If you think about some of the self-service portals that you use in your personal life, whether it's ordering an airline ticket or making a reservation or tracking a product delivery with Amazon or FedEx, it will have similar elements to those modern portal points where you can actually see the progress of your background check if you are a program administrator, you can see the steps that the activity is going through. The candidate portal has a little less functionality, but does allow the candidate to upload documents and to communicate with us. And finally, the viewer side of the application is how the BRC staff themselves, and that's where the richest amount of functionality is. That allows them to do case reviews and to do all the workflows to ensure that the processes are delivering the results that we want, and to have the appropriate separation of duties and other checks as we go through the process to make sure that all of the work is being done appropriately. So 3 core elements and 3 core access points in the technology: the program portal, the candidate portal, and what we call the viewer. I'm going to turn it back to Felicia for a brief comments about our compliance.
So the components that are being covered within the background record check process, I've gone over them to an extent, but just an overview of what those are again. One of those are the disqualifications. That was the mandatory disqualifications that we were talking about earlier. Those are a federal requirement that were updated in our regulations recently. So that's not included in the Massachusetts statute. Another change that's being implemented is the preliminary employment, or the conditional, unsupervised conditional versus the supervised provisional. That change is reflected in both statute and regulations. The level 1 sex offender check is something that was changed by statute when the new statute rolled out over the summer, and that information is not required by our regulations, but it is being implemented in the new system per state statute. The programs that were being referred to earlier as license exempt, just to clarify, those are just programs that they aren't subject to our licensure, and they receive funding from us through a voucher or contract. We also refer to them as funded programs. Those are not yet included, but they will be. They are required by CCDBG to be run, and those are covered in our regulations and statute. Additionally, there is a federal requirement related to not suitable. Right now, someone is only found not suitable if they have been found, if they've gone through the entire background record check process. The change there is we now, under federal law, can find someone not suitable for failing to respond, for providing false or misleading information during a background record check, and for failing to consent for a background record check. So that's in addition to being found not suitable after the review process or after having a mandatory disqualification. Additionally, there have been changes to appeals after a not suitable determination. We previously we've had appeals for those with any sort of hit. We call it the review process. The discretionary or presumptive review is an appeal, and then beyond that, if they're a licensee, they do get an appeal right to the Division of Administrative Law Appeals. So that's been codified within our regulations. The only exception to that would be the mandatory disqualification. There's no review process, no discretionary or presumptive review, just a not suitable. Additionally, there is subsequent activity that's within the realm of the regulations. It doesn't speak to it specifically, but it talks about receiving the consent that would allow for subsequent activity in a future release. So that is included within our regulatory changes. It's not a statutory change, and it's not a federal change either. And lastly, out-of-state checks is something within the horizon. On a federal level, we are supposed to complete out-of-state checks, but those are not due to be completed quite yet. So we did include language within our regulations that allow for out-of-state checks, but it doesn't specifically mandate them just yet.
Alicia, just a question. And I don't know if I'm misunderstanding this chart, but so if I understand that maybe the updated regulations include things that weren't previously included in the Mass statute. I'm guessing that's because of the requirements under CCDBG. I guess what I don't understand is if level 1 sex offender is included in the Mass statute, why is it not included in the other data regs, or was it already in there?
So it doesn't speak to the level. It just says all available sex offender information. So it just says it's more general. So we are now running level 1 sex offender checks. At the time that the regulations were drafted, we didn't have the authority in the statute yet, so we left it vague for that purpose.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'm getting confused. When reading this, that yes, it is in the statute, but no, it's not in the updated regulations, and I'm wondering.
Well, the statute controls, right?
Right.
So-
Yep. Right.
I'm saying if it's in the statute, you have the ability to regulate
Yes.
it, so, yeah.
It's just that the timing of it was problematic, right?
All right.
We can definitely fix that.
Right. Yep.
We're going to
Head into the agile
Yeah, we're going to head into and transition now into the process that's supporting all of this work, starting with the Secretary's question.
Not push press, okay. So obviously, there's a big compliance issue here, and we're trying to come into compliance with federal law. Sometimes when you do that, there's no added value, which is unfortunate, but I think there actually is quite a bit of value being added by this whole process that we're going through. And some of it's been alluded there. I just want to make sure as we kind of transition, we're not sort of forgetting that. On the one hand, this will represent a significant improvement around health and safety issues to make sure that the adults who are taking care of our children are, passing these kinds of checks, and that we're broadening those checks to ensure that we're actually identifying those people who, really need to be identified and need to not be taking care of our children in these programs that we support. In addition, all the efficiencies associated with the automated system should allow, again, for those certainly who are getting no hits, but even those who are getting hits to work their way through the process faster so that hiring decisions can be made in a more timely fashion. All of that feels like it's still, around the corner, but it really is coming into view as a result of the system being in place. There's also additional security for the applicants themselves because EEC is making these decisions and that information is not being shared with providers. It does present offsetting challenges, but nonetheless, there is a real benefit in terms of privacy protection for the folks who are sending us their information that I think is non-trivial. And then I think also, even though again this will put a much greater burden on the agency for making decisions, the system that we're developing will make the licensors a lot more productive in terms of the work that they need to get done. And so, were we to take on this responsibility in the absence of the work that's going on right now, it would be sort of an overwhelming human burden that we would place on the agency and cost. We're investing a lot in the system right now, so it feels like it's costing us a lot of money, but I think that is money that will be saved over time as we make the work inside the agency much more productive. So all that being said is, and I'm participating in this process at a distance, but I see it enough to know that this is a real slog, this is really hard work, the folks in the agency, the folks at Exceller, the folks at TSS, the folks sort of throughout our contractors and partners here are working incredibly hard at a breakneck pace in order to bring this project to conclusion. But I think the benefits are going to be really significant when they do. So I want to thank you all for doing that work. I want to underline the point that we're not just going through this exercise because we have to, but because there's real value in it.
Thank you, Secretary. Actually,
I probably just ought to thank Felicia in particular, who has been bearing the brunt of the suffering through this project. So anyway, thank you, Felicia.
Thank you.
Felicia has done an absolutely outstanding and remarkable job in the course of all of this. Thank you, Secretary. You effectively provided most of the context for the purpose of this slide, which is just to speak to and this is within the limited context of what is needed for a project management structure around only the IT development component of this project, which doesn't even speak to the other work streams that are necessary and essential for us to deliver on the definition of success that you saw earlier, because that touches on other areas of communication and training, agency capacity, things that are really essential for us to ensure that this is not only developing a fine IT system, but one which is accessible and can operate successfully across all of the stakeholders. Most importantly, those educators and administrators who are relying upon it, and the children and families behind them who are relying upon it to deliver the right results. But also for this agency, which is tasked with some enormous responsibilities under the Child Care Development Block Grant to administer this on behalf of the Commonwealth. So just looking at this structure, I wanted to make sure that it gave evidence to what's necessary in order to pull this off as an IT project. It is an IT project, one that has, its necessity in the fact that it's supporting our business processes for background record checks. EOE has been an essential partner within this work. EOE is responsible for overseeing the Secretariat's IT work, but we've received more than that from the Executive Office in the course of this, and Anne Reale has been instrumental in supporting this work, in providing leadership to this effort. And if she were here, I think it would be fair to say that she would be standing with Felicia among those that we would want to cite, among many who have put a lot into this. But we're also obviously deeply involved with the state secretariat for technology and security, that's EEOST, as well as some other critical partner agencies, the state's Department of Criminal Justice Information Systems, the FBI, our Department of Children and Families, because an essential component of our background record check processes is the DCF background record check, and a number of vendors and contractors who we're working with in order to deliver on this system, either for the technical support or for the organizational and operational support that's being provided by Exceller. This gives you a sense of the project management structure and the cadence of meetings that are required in order for this to be accomplished in pulling together all of these various entities. This talks about meetings that are occurring within the 5 business days. What I can tell you is that this is actually a 7-day-a-week effort, and has been now for many, many of the 18 months under which this project has been in development. So this is this effectively is being presented to you just so that you understand the sort of rigor and attention and importance that this is getting from a number of different parties. And again, it only touches on this slide the IT development component of the background record check piece. So you can imagine what's required as we are undertaking this work more broadly within the BRC project, and additionally across all of the other areas of CCDBG and broader business process redesign effort that we have contemplated for the agency.
The process that we're undergoing for project management is called the strategy to execution process, and we're also leveraging techniques called structured agile. The strategy to execution process is a process about getting really clear about what our strategy and vision is, in this particular case around background record checks, and then to design an operating model, the people, process, and technology to deliver on that vision and strategy for background checks. It's not about incrementally improving the old way we used to do it, but fundamentally coming up with a new, higher impact, more rigorous, more efficient way to do background checks, so we can handle the influx of more cases, but still have very even better turnaround times than we had under the old process. Agile Scrum is an emerging and increasingly popular way to manage projects. Instead of managing projects as kind of monolithic, giant Gantt charts and tasks, you manage the work every day in small teams. And Agile Scrum was actually invented by a fellow here from Massachusetts, Jeff Sutherland, who wrote a book called The Art of Getting Twice as Much Done in Half the Time. So pardon me?
We all need.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. Jeff was a fighter pilot, test pilot for the Air Force during the Vietnam era, and he was very frustrated because he would see faults in the munitions and nav systems in the jets, and it would take the Air Force months and months and months to get those remedies back into the cockpit. And so he invented Agile Scrum to make the process of making the jet fighter planes get these improvements in weeks instead of months or even years. So Jeff, we've adopted these techniques. They're highly effective techniques, and it's a mix of both Agile and structure. It's a mix of strategy and velocity. And also, importantly, there's a meta process at work here in that the agency is getting better and better and better every day at doing projects. And so high-performance organizations are both good at operations, and they're good at changing their operations and improving them. And that's why this meta goal of becoming really good at doing projects is an important meta objective of this initiative. The strategy to execution process moves us away from functional hierarchy. If you think about how most enterprises and agencies and organizations work, they still principally organize around a functional org chart. Importantly, the customer doesn't care about your functional org chart. They care about your business processes and your customer experience and your speed and your customer support and your service levels. And so by building a operation focused on process over function, we're going to get to a much higher performing and a much more durable organization and operating model. Go to the next. Now, in that lies a challenge. If you look at the curve, the maturity curve of any enterprise, whether it's public sector, private, not-for-profit, et cetera, they go through a life cycle where they're started, they go through a launch phase, they go through a maturity phase, and then many organizations go into a state of decline. Even highly successful businesses often fail because the environment they're operating in changed, and they didn't change with the environment. If you think of organizations like Sears right now going through this, or Blockbuster, and there's lots and lots of organizations that had enormous success but failed to make the transition to the next generation of their business model. So traditionally, business models are focused on functional hierarchy. In this graphic, we call it the 1.0 model. And often systems projects fail because they focus on automating the old model of work. Their orientation is about fixing or automating functions. And that's the wrong perspective to use when you're doing a project like this. The way we want to be focused is on the future. We want to be leaning towards our next generation model of the organization. And our orientation is how we deliver new and better end-to-end processes and create better outcomes for our customers. And the challenge is we need to simultaneously run and improve our current business model. We can't afford to stop that, right? We have to run and improve the current model while we transform to the new model. And so for right now, it feels like we're doing two jobs, and in fact, most of the staff are. They're running the old model every day, and at night and weekends, and transitioning to the new business model. And that is an enormous workload. You should take comfort, though, in that they're doing it well. They're working on all of these elements of not only thinking of this as a technology project, but looking at process, looking at job skills and organization structure, looking at how we measure ourselves, and the values and culture that we use in doing the work every day. Oh, do we have a question? No? Okay. So we're building the competencies to do this work. It involves new terms like sprint planning and daily stand-ups and retrospectives. A sprint is a 2-week piece of work usually. In this case, we're doing it as 1-week sprints. We're trying to go even faster in this phase. We're not only working on the BRC project, but at the same time, we're trying to transform our culture to this high-performance model of work. And we're very much focused on the customer and the programs and how we communicate with them, et cetera. All this is towards a series of go-lives. So our first go-live, am I taking this one? I can, yes, please.
Just to give us a concrete example of this in play in EDC, if you take your pieces, whether it's the sprint planning, but let's just say a daily scrum, how many people are involved in that scrum on average at EDC for this BRC project?
Across all of the Scrum teams?
How many teams do you have?
So presently we have
six.
I was going to say 5 or 6 teams. 6 teams. There are no less than 2 or 3 people in up to 4 on each of those teams.
Yeah.
And this is all within the context of the background record check project alone.
Okay,
That's what we're
helpful.
describing.
And the teams tend to be quite small,
The teams
like in general, in principle.
There is a degree of overlap between the individuals. Some of that's by design, some of that's by need. There are people that have particular knowledge and skills that would be essential to operate on 2 teams, but it's also intended to create a degree of necessary connectedness between the work streams, because you're constantly going to want to integrate that work, and so there's a strategic component of that as well.
And then twice a week you're gathering those teams.
Exactly right.
Okay, got it, thanks.
And there's some important principles in that and rituals that you do every day and every week to make sure that the teams are collaborating and learning from each other. And in many ways, the teams hold themselves accountable for their daily activities. And there's this old myth about projects, I want one throat to choke. I would rather have many hands to shake at the end of a successful project. And this way you get many people involved in the project, and they're all pulling in the same direction. They're all working at the same kind of velocity every day to get this done.
And if you don't mind, just I know that probably sounds nice, but in reality, it actually is really nice, and it's been a really important feature of this work for the agency. I just would offer that as I think an important testimonial. It is allowed us to have a sort of formal set of activities and structures to think more expansively about how we engage across the agency in this work. And that's why I think that there's going to be tremendous potential within extending this, not only to the other areas of CCDBG that we're working on, but through the business process redesign effort. And in fact, we have initiated those activities, and there's considerable amount of enthusiasm and buy-in from folks that see the benefit of that. So it's, in essence, just to state it simply, it's not relying on the usual cast of characters. It's compelling a broader engagement, and there's enormous commitment across this agency by all staff to the mission and to want to be involved. So it's effectively tapping, I think, so it's elevating it, and there's a lot of latent, I think, capacity that's being brought to the surface as a result of this.
Yeah. Well, I admit that Agile has been part of my personal life for a long time through the person I live with. So. It's fun to hear about it in the context of this mission-driven work.
Yes.
I would add from my own personal experience, it's wonderful when it works well.
Yeah, it's pretty lousy.
But it can be, it really needs to be, there needs to be full commitment, and it needs to be practiced, with a pretty high degree of fidelity.
That's true.
To make it effective.
And you need onboarding and all that kind of thing, right, longer term.
And you need structure. The structured part of Agile is often missing. A friend of mine has this great saying that context is worth 80 IQ points. If you give folks the right context for the work, if you give them the right environment to work in, if you're really clear about the strategy and goals, that's why you see the success criteria very clear. Often in these types of Agile programs, no one ever really defines doneness. How do we know when we're finished? Well, we're really clear about what doneness is for the various constituents that will use this system and this process.
So if I may, I hear a tremendous amount of value and a lot of excitement in this work, but I would really like to drive down into more concrete terms about what some of the kind of management language actually means in real terms. And I really have 3 questions for you. The first is, can you please give us a concrete example of the way in which the processes that you've described have problem solved within the context of BRC in a successful way?
Yeah. For example, data migration, which is a particularly knotty and difficult subject. The data migration task often sits at the very end of a project and sometimes is even is overlooked in the how do you migrate the 30 years of legacy data that we have to this new environment? And while you're transitioning from the old system to the new, how do you make sure that those systems are synchronized every minute? You can't allow them to get out of sync. That requires a real architecture and design of data migration, but then the daily work to discover what's going to happen field by field in these legacy systems and new systems and how we're going to keep them synchronized. If you're not doing that every day, you will slip on your project schedule because you got in trouble on data migration. Often that's not discovered till very late in the project. We're looking at that now, and we're driving that through the data migration team is looking hard at that work every day, working through all of the various issues that you would find in data migration.
Thank you. So my second question is, you talk about really sort of shifting away from the functional hierarchy, which certainly has merit, and yet, in this particular example, you're interfacing with more than 10 different outside entities, in addition to EEC and what is clearly under EEC's purview alone. So how do you deal with the fact that many of these other entities are in fact functional hierarchies that are, working within a democracy, have to adhere to rule of law and all of the kind of regulatory standards? So I don't know if you have a real-world example, or I believe at one point the FBI, for example, was not able to provide the information required by federal statute. And so, how does an agile process adapt to the realities of working within public bureaucracy?
Yeah, it is a challenge in that we have to work within the regulatory framework, as well as other organizations haven't embraced this way of working. And so when you do bump into this, for example, we have, in one of our pieces of correspondence in the system, we direct the candidate on how they can challenge their background check information and the various other agencies that they have to work with. And one of our pieces of automated correspondence tells them, fill in this form and send it to the FBI in McLean, Virginia, to get this process done. But if you actually follow that thread from end to end, you'll find out that the FBI doesn't want a paper form. In fact, they want an electronic form. If you do submit paper to them, it's a 16-week process. If you go to the right place, which is very difficult to find on their website, and we had to navigate our way through working with them to find out how do we do this in an automated fashion and direct our candidates to the right place to do this, not in 16 weeks on paper, but their service level, if you do it in an automated fashion, is 5 days. Much more consistent with what we would want to do. But in the traditional bureaucracy, we would have sent them to the generic person to reach out to or website to reach out to at the FBI. It required our team to work through that process to find what is the really correct channel to be directing. And you can just imagine a candidate trying to get a job who is directed to a website that says, we don't accept paper, but this other website told us to submit paper, and now they're in the classic bureaucratic kind of catch-22. We need to break through those. And it is difficult when we're trying to do it at the rate of Agile, and the other agencies we're working with may be working at a much different pace. That's one example. I'm sure there are many.
I would just add to Jack's response. the approach that we're taking, the Scrum teams are cross-functional and they're representative of many of these agencies. So it's not as though the Scrum teams are simply comprised of EEC staff and Exceller support. They actually include IT staff, they include our contractors, in some cases they include our partner agencies. And so it actually allows us to identify collectively the impediments much more quickly, and it gives us a forum to resolve those impediments. And if not, it also gives us multiple avenues to try to resolve those impediments where, an example of the FBI, for instance, not an agency that EEC deals with directly as a regular part of our business, but is in fact an agency that our public safety agencies deal with as a matter of course all the time. So being able to access through these structures, which are intentionally designed to be inclusive of multiple agencies, gives us an ability to resolve those issues in much more creative ways and much more quickly than would otherwise be the case. Isn't to say that within a project of this complexity that leads to quick and simple answers on everything. There are some really, really knotty issues that we have to wrestle with, but it does then bring together a collection of folks that have knowledge and expertise more expansive than just EEC to be able to problem solve together and solution together. So when it operates at a high level, it has all of those benefits. There's also, I think, from our experience, a real opportunity to ensure that a project otherwise, I think, would be developed in sort of parallel with isolated sort of discrete tasks. So you could, conceive of data migrations happening over here and the other systems development is happening over there. Just one easy example, if there isn't a project plan that aligns all of that and there aren't mechanisms such as a Scrum team or some other, something that's a proxy for that to ensure that the connections are happening, you're going to end up with a disjointed calendar, a tremendous amount of inefficiency, and far worse, something that's just plain disjointed and wouldn't actually result in the kind of system that you're looking for. So suddenly I've gone from, believe me, my Agile experience, I could tell you that if you'd spoken to me 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had a kind word to say, but seeing it performed at a higher level, there's virtue to it. Doesn't solve it. Ultimately, you're relying on the people, and we have relied heavily on people to really step up and make this happen, but I do think that it's given those folks more support and structures to be effective than I've seen in other instances.
One last question, if that's okay. So as you think about using some of these processes for other components of CCDBG compliance, what are some ways in which the processes get adapted, either to the scope of the project or to the nature of the project? How do you balance kind of dedication to process with dedication to product?
Right. Should I take that? Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't matter. I would say it's, and I don't know if I was, I intended to be purposeful of saying something earlier in the presentation when I talked about how this process would be replicated, but I would say in a modified form. I don't believe that every activity that we are going to need to undertake, whether it's for CCDBG or as part of a business process redesign effort, needs to mirror the intensity of what we're doing on background record checks. I think in relation to that, nor do we have the capacity to replicate the intensity of this process. But I do think that we would see in most instances something that would resemble this, and we're going to have to make some important, I think, strategic decisions about what we're going to focus on next. Even within the CCDBG context, we're going to have to identify which among these is going to receive, the next order of priority as we knock these things off in parallel in some cases, but we also have to think somewhat sequentially about how we're going to go about that. And so as we've engaged, at least in the preliminary business process redesign effort, the effort is to lay out, our entire enterprise here at EEC by process. Just going through that exercise is in itself an enormous value, having that kind of conversation, but it's going to necessarily lead to a prioritization effort immediately following. highest priority right now would be to make sure that we're meeting our child care development block grant responsibilities. But how do we do that in a way that logically is in service of our broader ambitions and is leading us in a sequential way to building the kinds of systems that we know that our early childhood system requires and would give us, greater success in meeting the broader mission of the agency, which is not simply about following laws, but trying to get to the kinds of child outcomes that we're seeking across the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
Spend some time on the rollout.
Yes.
Last question.
Okay, the first go live, which is scheduled for January 28th, is to allow the program administrators to access the program portal and to do cleanup and maintenance of their employee rosters. And that will start on January 28th is the current plan. And we believe we're going to reach that goal as of right now. And the second go live, and all of this is for group and school age, so we're dividing the population of programs into cohorts, and we're rolling out the new system by cohort. And so group and school age is up first. They will first be able to access the portal, get provisioned onto the portal so their program administrators can do the cleanup of their rosters, and that will position them for Go Live 2, which will happen on April 8th, when all of the rest of the functionality of the BRC processes will be in place, and we'll start doing all of the background checks for GSA on the new portal starting April 8th. This phased implementation gives them a chance to acclimate with the system as administrators, to clean up their rosters, and then be ready for the April 8th go live for the full functionality. And then we will have additional go lives and releases or phases for the additional cohorts of program types over the coming months after April 8th. As we mentioned, the rollout plan covers these 6 domains. So there's a systems development domain, a testing domain, which is doing the system testing and the end-to-end business process testing. And we hope to, prior to Go Live 2, to actually bring in programs and have focus groups with program administrators and others to get their fingerprints on the system and to have them use the system and give us feedback. Communications and training, you can see already a ramp up of communications and training through both our website and other mechanisms. The policy and process work is all about how do we develop the standard operating procedures and the policies so that we can both operate the new system but also have very efficient audits. When you're under an audit, it's all about, does the actual work reflect what the SOP says it does? And because we'll have well-documented and consistent SOPs, the audits should be very simple. We've spoken about data migration, and then staffing and support is getting the right number of staff in the right seats in the right organizational setting to do the new business processes. As we mentioned, the system will have the external user interface, so you have the work of developing the interfaces. We have a lot of work around the secure infrastructure and ensuring that all of this PII information is very secure on the web and in the cloud. We're going through ADA compliance testing as well, and then ease of use for both the candidates, the administrators, and the BRC staff. The testing work stream covers testing both prior to go live and post go live. Whenever you introduce a new business process and a new system, you find defects in the system not only prior to going live, but you find improvements and opportunities and even defects post go live. And so we're working through all of the business support processes to support testing throughout the life cycle of the system.
Communications and training. Am I still doing all these slides? Yeah, okay.
Do you want a break? I'll give you
No,
a
I'm
break.
fine. I feel like, do you want to go? Okay.
Sure. I'll give you a little rest. Now, communications and training is another work stream. As was pointed out earlier, there is an essential and important level of communication that needs to occur both internally and externally to all of the stakeholders that are involved. Internal, specifically to our BRC unit staff and to EEC licensors who are on the front line and are working hand in hand with programs and are often the individuals that programs turn to on a day-to-day basis with any questions. So we need to make sure that they're equipped with the information and the resources that they need to make this successful. And externally, clearly, to our programs who have an enormous stake in this in making sure that we have a smooth transition. So we've developed a much more robust than has been ordinary communication and training approach, and we have a work stream devoted to this. We built out a website here, mass.gov/EECBRC, which has a growing, really almost daily now, set of resources available to our programs. One thing that we are really, really excited about is that we're going to be producing those resources in languages beyond just English, Spanish and Portuguese and Chinese. I may have missed one additional language, but we have the support of the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development, which has infrastructure to be able to provide those translations for us. So we're really happy that we're going to be able to produce that in those multiple languages for a field that we know is, I think, importantly, and is a source of strength, a very diverse field. And we're providing trainings both internally and externally in the forms of webinars. We're recording those trainings so that they're available for folks that may not be able to participate in real time, as well as fielding a considerable amount of questions and translating those into frequently asked questions and providing those to the field. So we're in constant conversation and trying to be responsive both to those needs that are presenting themselves internally and externally, and we're committed to doing that not only through the rollout period, but as we move into the future. Obviously, background record checks are here to stay. The rollout is just going to deal with the here and now, but this is work that's going to necessarily be supported as we continue to move ahead here. So this is a long-term commitment on the part of the agency.
Sure. Another major work stream that we have created is a policy and process work stream. They're the ones who put together the different policies that relate to the background record check changes, as well as develop standard operating procedures about how the new processes will go in the new system. There's a lot of change to policies and the process that needs to be documented, both for the BRC unit and then also communicated externally through communications and trainings. Additionally, the policy and process work stream creates workaround processes for anything that is not being automated initially. So there are some things that we are delaying implementation until later date. So we're documenting those in the policy and process work stream. And then we're also putting these materials together to support the audit and compliance reviews that will occur in the future.
Yeah. In addition to SOPs for the operating procedures, we're doing all SOPs for data migration. The integrity of the data migration is really important, and to have everyone understand not only the one-time cleansing and migration of data, but the ongoing synchronization of data between legacy systems and this new BRC system is really important. And to do that, we're instituting the practice of writing SOPs for data migration as well, so you can actually prove all of the quality of data and how the procedures work daily, nightly, et cetera. Further, we're doing analysis of the staffing, and we're creating volume metrics around caseloads, around inbound number of cases to be worked, yield in terms of the types of cases, how many cases an individual reviewer should be doing per day and whatnot. We're going to be developing a set of new metrics around those and have a dashboard about such things as time to answer for questions and calls and all of our response type metrics. And we'll be having a dashboard in each of the various business areas and how they measure success of their processes in terms of service, cycle time, quality, et cetera.
Okay, and then I'm just giving you now a sense of what the new background record check, what we call the BRC Navigator, looks like. As was described earlier, there are multiple components to the Navigator. The component that's up on the screen before you is what we call the viewer, and this is the internal system. It's the most robust system, and it's the one that's being used or will be used by the background record check unit for processing background record checks and determining the status of those checks. So as I had discussed earlier, we are presently operating under a disjointed system. We have our CORI system, which runs the CORI check and DCF check. Our SORI check is done behind the scenes, and then we had a newer, pretty baseline system used for fingerprint checks. Those have never been merged together, so this is going to be a huge win for us because we're going to have everything all together in one place. Additionally, as we discussed earlier, for those without a hit on the record, it's going to be automated. There's not going to be a need for manual intervention. Right now, we have to manually intervene into all of the background checks regardless of the results of the hit. Additionally, the really nice thing about this new system is that you can see here when somebody is expired. That's always, difficult to do with our existing system. This is tracking for you exactly how old the fingerprint age is. It tells you the preliminary status right on the screen, and it's a very easy to view, and it gives you an overview of every single check that's required for each candidate. Next, there's a screenshot there of the program portal, which is within the BRC Navigator. So the program portal is what will be used by the programs that we license, this will be what they use to submit their candidates. Right now, they're using BRC Manager. That system was last updated in 2002, so this is a notable improvement for them. And they will be able to submit these individuals directly into the program portal. One of the big changes for them is, as we discussed earlier, they will not be reviewing the background record check information, but their main role within the program portal will be to go in and update the hiring status of their staff. So they will be able to see exactly where each person is in the process and then let EEC know whether they hired them or whether they decided not to hire them or whether the person ended employment. Additionally, a big change is that I don't think we talked about yet, but it's called suitability transfer, and this is something that is required federally. So when a program goes in to submit somebody, and that when they get to this screen, the first thing that the program portal will do will be look within the system to see if that person has been run before. If they have been run before, then it's, if the person, they'll receive an email, they'll be notified that another program is trying to access their background record check. They'll have to be answer a few questions about whether they've committed a new crime and whether they've had child welfare activity. There are other questions within our regulations. If they answer negatively to all of that, then the entire background record check will be automatically transferred to the new program. So right now, we don't allow for this under our legacy system, the system that we're using now. We do allow people to transfer their fingerprint result from one program to another, but each time they move programs, they have to redo their CORI and DCF check. So this will be a big positive win for programs and candidates who are working in these programs in the workforce, and that they won't be subject to the background record check process over and over and over again when they change programs.
But you did mention that's a process where the candidate approves your transfer of that information, correct?
Correct. And then the last screen that we have for you is the applicant portal or candidate portal. That is the system that is used by anybody that has an adverse finding on their background record check. So if they have a hit, they need to submit documentation to EEC. Right now, they would have to mail it in or email or fax the information. Under the BRC Navigator, they'll be able to upload it directly, and the person who's assigned to the actual review for this individual will get it within the system. And if there are any questions, the BRC unit staff can just reach out directly to the individual for additional information, and any additional documents can be submitted directly through this method. Another thing that that relates to this is that within the viewer, we will have a much more streamlined view of who is assigned to which review. Right now, we use an Excel spreadsheet, and there's a lot of searching that happens when somebody calls for a status update. So this will be a lot better for candidates who are applying to programs. And then another huge change that is being made is we have redone all of our letters and communications from within the BRC Navigator. That was upon the advice of the Exceller team to streamline the look and feel of the communications. We have this new letter template that's being used that actually is more readable, it's straightforward, and it gives you all of the information that you need in a more simple way. And it'll be very clear to the candidate that if they're receiving something on this new template, that it's actually coming from the BRC Navigator.
I just want to add again, to compliment Felicia and the folks that worked on this. I actually questioned to Felicia, how many letters total were there?
52.
52. So it was not a insignificant effort to create those 52 letters and to try to balance the necessary information that must be presented within those letters, but to do it in a way that is in fact accessible and friendly to the end reader. And to do it, again, in a format that's very different than, frankly, the present formats that we have right now, which are not very attractive, but also not very effective. And so an enormous amount of work went into that, and a credit to Felicia and all the parties that worked on that.
I have a really quirky question. I just really need to ask this question. Everywhere I go, everything I do, they say, what's the last 4 digits of your social security number? And I notice you say 6 here. Does that provide some significantly greater level of security, or what's that?
The last 6 is actually about what fields they're running through the background record check process, through Corey, DCF, and fingerprint. So that's why we asked for the last 6. I know it's different.
I was just curious. I have enough trouble remembering the last 4, and it's a problem for me.
So we've rounded third and we're heading home on the presentation. We wanted to share with you our next steps between now and the end of April. We're obviously going to continue to undertake our work to launch the BRC Navigator and what we're terming as Phase 1. In Phase 2 of those efforts, in order to be able to support group and school age programming, or programs rather, in using that system. And in parallel to that, we'll be undertaking our efforts on the other CCDBG activities in providing regular updates starting next month to the board around the timing and the sequence of how we're going to undertake those efforts as well. We have some activities that are coming up that we just wanted to flag again. I mentioned it earlier in the presentation. We have a monitoring visit. It's actually not an audit. It's a monitoring visit in April by OCC. We have several, and we've already had the first of those several planning meetings with OCC to get ready for that monitoring visit. I wanted to note they're not going to be, there'll be no additional action taken beyond the response that they provided us on December 21st relative to those areas that they pointed out that we still have activities to undertake in order to come into full compliance. When they come and monitor us in April, they may be looking at some of those areas, but likely not all of those areas. But even those areas that they're going to be looking at, they'll be asking us what progress we've made within those areas. We still have until September 30th of 2019 in order to satisfy those, and there'll be no penalties attached to any of those areas that were pointed out within that December 21st letter. And we've remained in good standing with respect to those through the remainder of that time until September 30th of 2019. So our plan is to continue to communicate very actively around this. This is going to be a massive amount of work for the agency, which is why we wanted to provide you with a detailed presentation. I see this presentation, frankly, as being foundational to many presentations that we'll be providing you over the course of this year, just to keep you up to speed on what's going on within our child care development block grant activities, but also as part of the process of business process redesign that we're looking to extend all of this work to and be inclusive of. So that touches just on CCDBG. It doesn't get to some of the other major areas of activity that you know that we're engaged in, supporting CureAS 2.0 and building out those systems of supports, launching the career pathways grant in those activities, potentially partnering with New Profit and working on an early childhood service organization coaching infrastructure, getting all of our grants out, doing all the day-to-day operational work of licensing 9,000 programs statewide. So this is all on top of all that work, which I'm not raising to point out anything other than just that obvious point. It's a lot of work for the agency. We're committed to it. We have a responsibility for getting it done. We really look forward to working with you in the spirit that you've always worked with us, which has been supportive, but also in providing us with the level of oversight that we benefit from to get this work done at a high level. So we wanted to provide this, again, as context for that work, in particular over this next 9 to 12 months that relate to CCDBG, but are even going to be broader than that. And we're happy to take any further questions that you have or any comments that you have with respect to this.
And I just want to make another comment. The Commissioner has been very dedicated to the BRC project and the CCDBG activities himself. He's been involved day in and day out with us as part of the team, so I want to make sure that he was recognized as well.
I'd like to just thank all of you for some really remarkable work. I was sharing with Attorney Sullivan at the December meeting how impressed I was with some initial documents I saw on this. And look, this is good for families. This is even better for kids. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to echo that sentiment as someone that my first background check was with an ink pad and then a manual check through something that looked like an index card. So recognizing this and bringing in the expertise of Accelerator, I think, was a great decision to be made, and obviously the support. I think that we know that a lot of times systems can be improved, but in government we tend to do the same things in a certain way over and over again, and a lot of people are resistant to change. So I applaud all of your efforts and the fact that you have a dedicated team that's willing to move EEC forward in a very meaningful way in terms of being in the, state-of-the-art position on background checks, but also, for the benefit of all of the families that we serve. So thank you all.
You're here.
Yeah. I have a question, a simple question. Wearing my higher education hat. Students who are going to be interning or student teacher or anything will go through the exact same thing. What happens if you have international students who do not have a social security number?
We have a process for that. With the submission process, there's a box that they can check. If they haven't been issued one, they can still be run through.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So a few last things. I'll certainly echo, and some of you know that I am at an arm's length from Tom on a regular basis, and I can say this has certainly been just an enormous amount of work, and I have certainly witnessed the commitment, including from the undersecretary, but the commissioner and his team, Felicia in particular, and obviously all those other folks who are meeting all the time. So thank you all. I think the other thing I would say, big picture, is agile or another name. I think the one thing that I have, the refrain that we have all been part of for many years is just capacity at the agency level to manage the amount of work. And I think the step back and the investment in this process to kind of shift mindsets towards project management and project-based work, for which more is coming down the pike, I think is just a tremendous step in the right direction. And I do really want to commend the commissioner for leading that effort and for getting buy-in relatively quickly on a very different way of working. And that says a lot about what may be to come. And I think what we want to pay attention to as a board and a leadership team is what lessons are we learning from this? When Acceler is out of the picture, what does the agency look and feel like? How many people are in the position to really lead the projects, to kind of oversee this work, and which kinds of projects are the right fit? And so I think that's the meta level learning down the line. I'm not suggesting we should be there now, but I think that's what we want to think about over time as a way to improve the agency's capacity without necessarily having the resources for all the FTEs we know that would be needed.
I think that's right, and just building on that a little bit, I think, the agency's at a new inflection point in really sort of rethinking the way it's functioning, which is exciting. I think it would also be really helpful for the board to get feedback from you about the ways in which we can be supportive in that process, whether it's through an updated strategic plan or by ensuring that we are pursuing opportunities that are in line with broader priorities, and ensuring that, as the inevitable kind of tertiary urgent matters arise or crises occur, that we are kind of built to accommodate those in a way that I think historically we have not been, but really need to be. So there's a lot of opportunity here, certainly for the agency, but I think also for the board as well.
It's a great point, certainly, no question. And I think in concrete terms, I think the other consideration is what it means for budgets going forward, because, it could be that there isn't a moment where we don't need a third party, and that is part of the investment in the overall strategy that will still result in savings. But we want to think too about the financials of this, because we have the CCDBG supplement at this moment in time.
Progress requires investment.
That's right, exactly. And I think it would be a shame for all of this to live within the BRC project and maybe a couple more CCDBG lines, but at some point, what does it mean for the way we think about the agency? I also couldn't agree more on, what does this mean for the strategic plan and et cetera, et cetera. So really great to have the 2019 kicked off with this presentation, and I agree that you've laid the foundation then for updates on other pieces where we'll understand a little more about the project-based nature of the work.
Right.
So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for the engagement. Thank you for the feedback. Just to the earlier point, the buy-in, I think, has been really, and just to repeat what I said earlier, just a function of how deeply people care about doing this work well at this agency. And notwithstanding the fact that there's a heavy burden on the plates of many across the agency, there's been an astonishing, I think, level of willingness to engage in this, and not just a willingness, but I think a real desire on behalf of a number of folks across the agency to be committed to a process of moving this agency forward into trying to realize the mission that was created in 2005 when the agency was created, but the structures, quite candidly, weren't in place and the resources weren't in place to be able to make that mission possible. And I think we've been iterating towards that over the course of time. And I think we are, in fact, at an inflection point to be able to make some significant advancements in that regard. And I didn't intend to, I accidentally skipped over. I had spoken to the chair, and we see this process as being something that could have real value to the next iteration of the strategic plan for this agency. And frankly, I think it could produce a strategic plan that is perhaps more relevant in sort of actionable to the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. The strategic plans that we've had, I think, have been reflective of the aspirations of the agency, and I think we're at a point in time in which our system development is mature enough that we can really ground the strategic plan in some real concrete activities. So I see this work as really tying in. And the board, I appreciate your comment, Joan, is an absolutely essential stakeholder to all of this. Not the least of which is to provide oversight to this work, but also for us to dialogue around the decisions that are going to be necessary. We are going to have to continue to prioritize. We're going to have to think about resource allocation. We're going to have to think about what resources we have that may need to be reappropriated into other areas, but also what resources might, in fact, just simply be necessary to add to the work for us to do it at a higher level. And that's a conversation that is bigger than just the agency and necessarily would involve all of our stakeholders, but the board being front and center within those conversations. So we're looking forward to engaging you in that.
Yeah, and just to circle back to the retreat, you know, what we ultimately want to do with any kind of next strategic plan, not only would it be at a grain size where we could imagine it as an accountability mechanism for everyone, all of us involved in the work, but also to be the moment where the health and the safety and the compliance and the licensing comes together with the program quality improvement. And I think we started to hear some of that today as well. So, great. Thank you all. It's 3:32. We will see you next month. Thanks.
Jack, thank you very much.